Chris Alvarez, and welcome to Military History Inside Out, brought to you by War Scholar. We talk about military history from ancient to modern times and everything in between. You can find more podcast episodes, written interviews, word games, and the most detailed military history timeline on the web at warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com. We're on YouTube at warscholar1945. You can send comments and suggestions to info@warscholar.org. Thanks for listening. I'm speaking with Dr. Amy Rutenberg, author of Rough Draft, Cold War Military Manpower Policy, and the Origins of Vietnam-Era Draft Resistance. Thank you for speaking with me.
Thanks so much for having me.
So first, how did you get into studying and writing on this subject?
I guess as with most things, it was a process. I've always been interested in the question of why people serve in the military, what propels people into battle, probably from watching war movies with my father. But then I am also have always been interested in the question of gender. And so I started looking at women in the military, particularly during World War II and the Cold War. But I realized that I couldn't make any connections or compare anything about the recruitment of women without understanding how men ended up in the military. And of course, the answer for that was the draft. And I found that there really wasn't a whole lot written, and it just sparked my curiosity. So that sort of led me down the path where I ended up.
So your degree is in history, or?
Yes, I have a PhD in modern American history, and my focus is women and gender history.
Oh, okay. All right. Is this your first book, or have you written others?
This is my first book. It originated as my dissertation at the University of Maryland.
Oh, okay. All right. So tell me about the subject matter and focus of the book beyond, what the title provides.
Sure. So I started with the question, as I perceived it, of why it became more socially acceptable for men to avoid military service during the Vietnam War. My parents are of that generation, and I grew up sort of with a vague understanding that the Vietnam War was very controversial and people didn't necessarily want to fight in it, and that a lot of people were able to wiggle their way out of service in one way or another. And as I started digging, what I found is that that's actually always been the case in American history. And so I start the book in World War II because that's sort of the understanding that it's the greatest generation, and everyone rushed to join up after Pearl Harbor, and everybody, men wanted to serve. They wanted to beat the Nazis. They wanted revenge on the Japanese. They wanted to serve. And what I found is that, yes, it's true. By the end of the war, almost 80% of the male cohort born in the 1920s was in uniform. But the process of getting them there was incredibly difficult. It required a lot of effort and expenditure on the part of the federal government. And truthfully, when people had the opportunity to avoid service legally, they tended to take it, which then makes Vietnam not all that unusual. The difference, and this is what the book traces, is that the policies and procedures that were put in place by the Selective Service over the course of the Cold War just made it much easier, particularly for middle-class white men, to avoid service by the time of the Vietnam War.
Mm-hmm. And I see in the blurb about the book that I guess this comment that officials thought that college-educated men could help the nation better by staying, at home as civilians versus the poorer population would be better off used, actually doing the fighting.
Yeah, it wasn't specifically said that way, but that's what the bulk of the book deals with. So the first chapter talks about World War II, and the last chapter talks about Vietnam, and everything in the middle is those years in between. And what I found is that the federal government decided to keep the draft in place between World War II and Vietnam, including during times of peace, which was unusual for American history. And they did so because of the threat of the Cold War, for fear that nuclear war could erupt anywhere and that the United States would have to mobilize quickly. So they wanted to keep the force in being larger than usual. But there were also more men than were necessary, even for a larger than usual force in being. And so the question became how to decide which men to draft and which men to defer, because it just didn't look good if only a very, very small percentage of eligible men were taken. So what they did was essentially make fewer men eligible by granting deferments. And the way that the deferment structure grew was based on expectations around Cold War defense. It was acknowledged that scientists were necessary. You know, what was going to be the next bomb? What would be the next penicillin? What would be the next, piece of engineering? So men who entered STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, got deferments. And of course, those men were virtually all college educated. So there was a requirement that you be able to afford college and stay in college in order to be able to get the college deferment, which was put in place during the Korean War, and then keep a deferment after graduation. So those are going to be primarily middle-class men. Mm-hmm. And then there was also the structure of dependency deferments that expanded and contracted throughout this time. But basically the idea was that fathers were really necessary on the home front, particularly, and that had always been the case, but particularly in this Cold War environment where the nuclear family led by a male breadwinner with a stay-at-home mom and 2.5 kids in the white picket fence at home, they needed the money that the male breadwinner earned to buy the things that made American consumer capitalism function and made it look good around the world. And so that entire deferment structure was then shored up and had the unintended, I would say, consequence of favoring middle-class men. And then in the early 1960s, during the Kennedy and then into the Johnson administration, focus shifted to poorer men who also tended to be disproportionately men of color. And the idea that military service could be used to help train these men to get skills that maybe they didn't receive in core schools or elsewhere, job skills, literacy training skills, that they could then use to become breadwinners as civilians. So poorer men ended up, and by poorer men, I poorer than the middle class men, I should say. So we're talking about primarily working class men, could be targeted for service. And actually, a series of programs were put in place in the early 1960s to try to identify men who didn't qualify for military service through the process of pre-induction exams. That men who failed their pre-induction exams could be targeted for social services. And when that wasn't enough, the Department of Defense under Robert McNamara began Project 100,000. Which was designed to bring 100,000 men per year who were previously not eligible for military service because they didn't have enough schooling, they had physical problems, something that could be fixed in the military, the theory was. And they would be brought in both through enlistment, voluntary enlistment, but also through the draft, so involuntarily.
I've spoken to another historian that said that program was kind of a disaster, that it created more problems, well, a huge number of problems, and also they found that a large number of Vietnam War casualties, either injured or dead or killed, were suffered by these people you're just talking about right now.
Yeah, it was a mixed bag. It's hard to have the numbers exactly because they weren't clearly kept. What we do know is that these men who were brought in through Project 100,000 overwhelmingly ended up in the infantry because they didn't qualify for other MOSs, for other specialties. And if you ended up in the infantry, you were then overwhelmingly going to end up in Vietnam, because one of the side effects here is that the program was not created, as some sort of cynically say, to create cannon fodder for Vietnam, but it did coincide with the growth of American involvement in Vietnam. And so these men did overwhelmingly end up in the infantry in Vietnam, and therefore likely their casualty numbers were higher. And though most did succeed They weren't washed out. They did wash out at higher rates. They were dishonorably discharged at higher rates. And of course, those are things that follow you through life. If you're dishonorably discharged, that follows you. If you die in combat, that follows you as well. So yeah, it didn't work out as expected.
I also have a couple questions brought up by what you were saying before. One, as far as scientists remaining as civilians and not soldiers, obviously the active duty military needs some scientific minds, if not to do research, but at least to manage projects. Was there any kind of tension or pushback from active duty military in any way to what civilian federal officials, DoD civilian leadership was trying to do in that regard? And also in the same vein, bringing in the kind of, like this 100,000 program, did the active duty military push back against civilian leadership as far as the quality of soldier being brought in? Did the active duty have a problem with all these deferments?
Well, the question around Project 100,000 is a lot easier to answer. Yes, active duty did have a problem and pushed back against the program. It was sort of unofficially referred to as the Moron Corps or McNamara's Morons. So it didn't last very long. It was ended before the Vietnam War ended.
Hi, I'm speaking with Dr. Amy Rutenberg, author of Rough Draft. You can find her on Twitter at AmyJ401. If you like this podcast, please like, comment, and follow me on warscholar.org, under Military History Inside Out, at your favorite podcast feed, on Twitter at Warscholar, on Facebook at Warscholar, and on Instagram at Chris Alvarez Warscholar. Now back to the podcast.
In terms of the deferment structure, it's hard to say. Through the years of peace during the Cold War, so not the Korean War, not the Vietnam War, the reality is that there was high stringency for who actually would qualify for service. So, in other words, the people who were getting drafted, even though they were more likely to be working class, they were absolutely educated. They had high school education, some college education, and they did their jobs well. That was not a particular problem. And because it was, generally speaking, a low number of people who were drafted, morale was also decent. One of the things that the draft did was that it pressured people to actually enlist on their own. And that's one of the major reasons why DoD kept it in place. The idea was that if people could enlist rather than waiting for the draft to get them, they would have more control over their branch of service, more control over the qualities of their enlistment and how it affected them, what job they could do. And so it pressured people into enlisting on their own. Mm-hmm. So morale was okay.
Mm-hmm. Now, so I assume the draft was just used during the Korean War and the Vietnam War. Is that correct, or were there other times in this period when it was used?
No, it was in place from 1940 to 1973, almost without break. Mm-hmm. There was one brief little 18-month period in 47, 48 when nobody was drafted. Mm-hmm. But otherwise, it was in place through that whole time. Draft calls, in other words, the number of men who were actually inducted, mm-hmm. fluctuated. Obviously went up during Korea, went up during Vietnam, went up briefly during the Berlin crisis in 1961, but primarily were quite low. So relatively speaking, very few men were actually being drafted, but the military was able to use the pressure of the draft to help boost voluntary enlistment.
So as far as, so is the book broken down chronologically, or do you address themes? Or are the chapters broken into different themes about this issue?
It's more or less chronological. Chapter 1 looks at World War II. Chapter 2 looks at the fight for universal military training in 1945 to 51, which is an entire movement to try to create a system whereby all able-bodied men in the United States at age 18 would receive some kind of military training. And it came decently close to passing, but did not. Then I move on to the Cold War, which is broken into a chapter on the Korean War and then a chapter on the late 1950s. And then there's a chapter looking at those programs to, quote, rehabilitate poor working class men. Mm-hmm. And then the final chapter is on Vietnam.
So how about this idea? I'd like to explore more this idea of masculinity and the draft and enlisting and all that you brought up.
We have a tradition in the United States of equating military service and this ability to defend the nation as being something very masculine. We see that through propaganda posters. People might be able to envision in their heads from World War II, John Wayne movies, some of the recruitment ads that have run over the years, all different kinds of places. And that is very true for a lot of people. Certainly, you can find all kinds of people who are veterans talk about having joined, for example, the Marines to become a man. Mm-hmm. Help you grow up, help you mature, help you learn responsibility, as well as protect others. And that is very true. On the other hand, it is an ideal that has also been somewhat constructed over time. There are other ways that our society has pushed men to, quote, be men. Support a family, for example, is very much seen as a masculine responsibility. And so those ideas of masculinity are sometimes in tension with one another. And that's one of the things that the book talks about, where in the peacetime moments of the Cold War, breadwinner masculinity was a lot more important, even as the country worried about nuclear war with the Soviet Union. And so how do you strengthen the nation? How do you strengthen the nation's manhood? These are long-standing questions and ones that I try to deal with in the book. And what I ultimately found is that by the time of the Vietnam War, for white middle-class men, and to be clear, this wasn't universal. I'm not saying all white middle-class men, but in general, the sort of trend was that their masculinity, their citizenship, they weren't defining that by military service because they'd been more likely to receive deferments over the years. And so when the deferment structure started to contract and when more people started to be called up for the draft, they looked for ways to get out of it. It wasn't about, I'm just going to acquiesce. This is what's expected of me. This is part of who I am. It really was, this is a bad war. I don't want to fight it, and I don't have to, and I'm going to find a way to avoid it. And that, legally or illegally, and for most it was legal. They found ways to finagle deferments, and they did, because they had resources to be able to do so, resources that working class men didn't always have.
Now, I've heard that, or I've read that protests against the Vietnam War dropped off drastically once the draft went away. Is that accurate, or can you comment on that? Yeah, the move to change to a lottery in late 1969 and then to end the draft, it was basically just allowed to expire. It was an attempt by the Nixon administration to sweep the legs out from underneath the anti-war movement, with the expectation and understanding that a lot of people were involved in the anti-war movement because they didn't want to get drafted. And if they no longer faced being drafted, then they would just stop agitating to end the war. And on some level, that is true. But on another level, the anti-war movement spread and became more mainstream after 1969. So, and folks' opinions of the war continue to drop. So on one level it is true, but on another it's not. There were huge protests in 1969, 1970, 1971. So it's partially true. Okay. Now, maybe this is beyond the scope of the book, but I'm just wondering, balancing in the event of a nuclear war, do to some extent, having a huge military what would be the point of a huge draft of military men if there's global annihilation threatening everyone? Can you discuss some of the Department of Defense thinking on this matter, or is that you didn't touch on that?
No, I did actually. So that's part of why the press for universal military training failed. Realistically, it's a lot of resources to put into something that may not be necessary, particularly as warfare begins to change. As technology changes, strategic and then tactical nuclear weapons are created, you need fewer infantrymen. Never mind the fact that those infantrymen would be, susceptible to radiation poisoning. It doesn't make sense to put more people on the battlefield at that point. But the Selective Service, under the leadership of Louis B. Hershey, who was its director for pretty much this entire time that I'm talking about, he actually did see a role for the Selective Service, if not the draft and the military, in the event of nuclear annihilation. So he talked about using the Selective Service essentially as the storekeeper of his manpower, of keeping track of even those men, because it was men, who didn't qualify for military service, but who could be used on the home front in the event of nuclear catastrophe. The way that the Selective Service functioned, it was very localized, right? Local boards kept track of local men. So the theory was that if Washington was bombed and no one at the head could help communities, the local Selective Service could step in because they knew who was there and what skills those people had, and could actually help in local spaces. And that was part of the rationale of actually the creation of the WWII deferment, which is the one actually that President Trump ended up receiving, which is you're not quite strong enough for actual military service, but whatever the mitigating factor is, you could still be useful on the home front in an event of a national emergency.
Interesting. So were these Selective Service Boards, were they federal officials or were they state officials who were supporting the federal program?
They were just local people in the community. They were appointed technically by the president, although they were identified at the state level. Basically, the way the Selective Service works is that it has always had a very small presence in Washington, D.C., where its headquarters is. The head is a presidential appointment. And then there are state offices, state headquarters in every state in the nation, and then thousands of local boards across the country. And each one of those local boards consisted of citizens in the community who were appointed. Basically the way they were identified is that they were pretty much all pillars of their community, almost all veterans, and pretty much all men. But they were civilians and they were not paid. It was a volunteer position. Okay.
So I'm feeling some sense of confusion as far as the Selective Service and the draft. Why?
Yes.
Why does the Selective Service seems to be preparatory for a draft in a way? What's the interplay there, or was, when the draft existed?
Well, thank you for asking that question. I probably should have explained that earlier. So a lot of people today are familiar with the Selective Service because they or their sons or someone in their family has to register when they turn 18. So the Selective Service is in place here in the United States at the moment. The idea is that if there were a national emergency, then those records being kept by the Selective Service could be activated by the government to create a draft, whereby people would actually be called into military service. That would require an act of Congress. So right now, Congress has authorized the Selective Service to exist, but we don't have conscription. We don't have a draft. No one's being involuntarily called up. And for that to happen, there'd have to be an act of Congress. Between 1940 and 1973, men were required to register with the Selective Service, but there was an active draft at the time. And then the number of men who would actually be called month to month would fluctuate based on the needs of the military and what the situation actually was at any given time.
Mm-hmm.
The draft and selective service were allowed to expire at the end of the Vietnam War. And between 1975 and 1980, nobody registered. President Carter, in response to Afghanistan and rising Cold War tensions during his administration, put back in place the need to register. And so since 1980, men have been required to register, not women. The Supreme Court said they didn't have to. And where that goes from now, that is actually all very much up in the air. There was a report actually just issued yesterday by the National Commission on Military, National, and Public Service.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a commission that's been working for 3 years to look at some of these questions. It just put out its report yesterday recommending that women be required to register as well. Congress will have to act for anything to happen, but it's possible.
So Carter's action, was that a congressional law that he signed, or is it an executive order in place?
No, it's a law.
Okay.
I think, actually, that's a really good question. It's a law. I know, it's a law.
Okay. And also, just going back to the draft, the early years, I know that the U.S. military, before it fully understood the dangers of nuclear fallout, would test bombs near soldiers or service members, just to test the effects. Do you know if draftees were used for that, or active duty, or was it just whoever was available?
Well, once a man was drafted and brought into the military, he was active duty. Mm-hmm. So the soldiers who were nearby nuclear tests were active duty. Specifically who they were, it's probable that it was a mix of voluntary enlistments and draftees, but I don't have specific information on that.
Okay. And how would the U.S. military put forth a request for draftees? Would it be by service, or maybe a specific function needed more people, or how did that play out? Do you know?
Sure. So through most of the period that I'm looking at, between 1940 and 1973, the Army, which is the largest branch of service, was the one that most needed draftees. Through most of this period of time, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Marines were able to meet their quotas through voluntary enlistment. Now, to some extent, it's believed that the draft pressured some of those men to voluntarily enlist in those branches of service, but that's different. So primarily only the Army was using draftees, except during times of war. And then the way that worked is the Department of Defense and the Department of the Army would sort of look at what they thought their manpower needs would be going forward, and they would give that information to the Selective Service. And then the Selective Service headquarters would issue a quota that was then divided up by state. So how many men per state are we looking to induct this particular month? And then that information would be divided down to the local boards, who would begin to call up men in their local communities for pre-induction exams. More men were sent for exams than they knew they would actually induct, because some men would fail. But the numbers were sort of divided out based on an expectation at the national level, and then sent down to all the local boards.
Were there, for someone who was facing the draft, were there pros and cons as far as just going ahead and enlisting voluntarily versus being taken as a draftee?
Yes. So until 1969, when it changed, the way that people were eligible for the draft was actually from the oldest available man first. So from age 26 on down, not 18 on up, which meant that men faced the threat of being drafted all the way up until age 26, and actually even older if they had taken deferments. So that meant that you had this cloud potentially hanging over your head for all of this time. So if you had just enlisted and got your service out of the way, then you could make a decision about when in your life you wanted to serve. Also, if you enlisted, you could choose your branch of service, and therefore would be potentially more likely, or I should say less likely, to end up in infantry. And so though you would enlist usually for 4 years and a draftee only went in for 2, you could take back some control of your life if you enlisted.
Interesting. And do you have any stats as far as number of draftees who actually ended up staying long term in the military or made it a career?
No, I'm sorry. I don't.
No problem. I think that I'm just curious about that. Hi, I'm speaking with Dr. Amy Rutenberg, author of Rough Draft. You can find her on Twitter at AmyJ401. If you like this podcast, please like, comment, and follow me on warscholar.org, under Military History Inside Out at your favorite podcast feed, on Twitter at Warscholar, on Facebook at Warscholar, and on Instagram at Chris Alvarez Warscholar. Now back to the podcast. Okay, are there, before I want to turn towards how you did the research for the book, but are there any other secondary themes and such that we haven't touched on that you might want to mention?
Why folks serve, about their ideas about the military, about what meanings we associate with military service or with civilian service, or what civilian service even means. So there's a lot wrapped up in that.
Okay. So do you discuss those topics to a great degree in the book as well then?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. How did you do the research for the book? What did you depend on?
So I depended a lot on federal records, particularly records kept at the National Archives on the Selective Service and the Department of the Army, as well as records at various presidential libraries. I really wanted initially to be able to talk about how men individually made decisions. And I found that that's a really hard question to answer for a couple of reasons. One is that obviously people are very diverse and they have all different kinds of reasons for doing what they do. But the second is that the men I was most interested in are the ones who would be hardest to find. These are not veterans. They're not people who would be members of veterans organizations of any level, because I'm most interested in the men who didn't serve. And they weren't necessarily protesters. You could find the leaders of various anti-war organizations. But again, the people who I was most interested in, the people who legally avoided service, they weren't necessarily activists either. They were just guys living their lives who looked for a way to not have to serve in the military. So they were hard to find. But so this became a book about, well, then how did the government make its decisions about which men to draft and which men to defer? So there's a lot of official records in there. I also look a lot at press records, at newspaper coverage, at magazine exposés, at trying to get at what's going on in communities and with individual men. And that did lead me to oral histories, which I used from the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress and elsewhere. And then I also began to find records from local organizations and groups, particularly draft counselors, by the time we get to the Vietnam War. And that is another thing that's really unique to Vietnam, this phenomenon of draft counselors, who were people sometimes working through organizations like the American Friends Service Committee, sometimes just not working through organizations, just a group of people or individuals who just started learning about the draft law and what deferments were and how people got them and how to best maximize clients' ability to get a deferment. And they advertised their services and they spoke to people and they were around in communities and they helped men get out of the draft legally for the most part. And that was new in the Vietnam War. And it was part of how ideas about service not really being required, not really being a part of men's identity, I think expanded. And so I found some of those records, which were really interesting, and I'm continuing to look at that. I think it's a phenomenon. Draft counseling is a phenomenon that certainly people of my generation and younger have, I think, all but forgotten. And one poll I saw said that up to 25% of draft eligible men during the Vietnam War received counseling of some kind. So that's a pretty impressive number.
Yeah. What's the earliest year you found that draft counseling was advertised or offered?
So there were some longstanding peace organizations, the Central Committee for Conscientious Objectors, the Metropolitan Board for Conscientious Objectors, also the American Friends Service Committee, who had small sort of counseling apparatus set up from World War II on, probably even before, specifically for sincere, religious, conscientious objectors who opposed all wars. And they helped those men receive conscientious objector deferments. So there's a long-standing sort of core of draft counselors, but the phenomenon expanded and grew really significantly during the Vietnam War. As people who were not necessarily sincere, religiously based, conscientious objectors began to look for ways out.
So would you say, so that would be about, 62 or more like 65? Or I'm just trying to really narrow down.
Things began to ramp up, I think, in 65. It really was with the growth of draft calls and the commissioning of ground troops in Vietnam that began to grow as a phenomenon. And it continued to expand and really hit its peak in 69, 70, 71, 72. So it grew significantly at that point.
Yeah, I mean, this idea, this tension of, people being rah about the war, but then also like openly, and especially I'm thinking of, wealthier kids and such who are openly like, you know what, I think I'm going to do something else. I'm not going to join in the war, and still be manly about it is just, to me, that's pretty fascinating, that mental shift within the nation.
Yeah, it really is. And I think some of us can probably see this in our own families. I know I remember having a conversation around a diner table with my grandfather, who served in North Africa and Italy during World War II, and my father, who just decided to become a doctor and not serve in Vietnam or in the military at that point in time, and just having that conversation with them around what service meant, around their thoughts of the military. I think that probably is an idea that resonates in a lot of family trees.
It's interesting. What part of the research was most enjoyable for you?
That's a good question. I found the research on World War II actually really interesting, because I was certainly raised with that grandfather who served in Italy and North Africa, and thinking about the role of service in that particular generation's life and the greatest generation narrative. And then to go in and actually have that completely overturned as I started looking at people's stories and the stories they told about how they tried to avoid getting drafted for as long as possible, was really fascinating to me. In the end, by 1943, 1944, it was very hard to get a deferment. Which is why so many men served. But that piece of the story that they all tried up until that point, or not all, but that many, 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 many tried up until that point, was just, it sort of shifted my perspective on things a little bit.
And this might answer the next question, which is, what did you find that was most surprising in your research?
Well, definitely that was part of the answer. I just find the question of service really interesting, and particularly how it relates to ideas of citizenship and masculinity, and what we expect of our citizens, what we want from our citizens, what we hope from our citizens, and that relationship between the rights of citizens and the right to liberty and the right to individual choice, and the responsibility of what it means to serve in a republic and to be a citizen of a republic. I think that is a very complicated relationship. It's constantly shifting, But if you look at recruitment ads, if you look at some of the expectations of average Americans and of politicians, these expectations are sort of built on a bedrock that seems like it doesn't shift.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not really the case.
Did you come across any deferment reasons that seemed very surprising to you, or very specific, almost to the point where it looked like some group lobbied for this specific deferment?
Not specifically, but the way that people used deferments was certainly interesting. You look at the National Guard. Reserves and National Guard were used as a draft haven from the 1950s on. The government itself actually created programs to try to get men into the reserves and the National Guard, to get them out of the pool of eligible draftables. Because if that pool is smaller, it looks like the Selective Service is doing its job. And that's how the Guard and Reserves became a haven during Vietnam, and how football teams and people with privilege, professional athletes, children of important rich people ended up in reserves and Guard, and they didn't ever get activated.
What was the most difficult question for you to research? Maybe something that you still don't have a good answer for in your mind, or maybe you did reach a conclusion, but it just took a lot more work than the other aspects.
I think getting at individual men's stories is always the hardest. I am very comfortable in my conclusions and in the trends that I've uncovered, but I'm also very aware that the story that I tell does not match every man's lived experience. Mm-hmm. And I think that one of the most interesting things that I've encountered since I've started talking about the book in public is some of the pushback that I've received because the story doesn't match an individual man's experience or an individual family's experience, mm-hmm. but also some of the confirmation that I've received because it does. And so sort of acknowledging that diversity of experiences, I think, is really important. And, as I get excited and telling the story that I have to tell about how white middle-class men got more deferments and working-class men were more likely to be drafted, and that's true in the aggregate, but it's not true for everybody. And I think that remembering to acknowledge that every time I speak about this book is important.
Mm-hmm. Now, do you discuss at all what women felt about the issues that you talk about in the book?
As best I can. This is a very masculine story because only men were liable for the draft. However, those men had families. Mm-hmm. And one of the trends that is very clear is that during times of war, women in men's lives also work to keep those men home. Whether that is rushing to the altar to get married, to have a dependency deferment before a deadline when those go away, or having a baby, or quitting their jobs in certain cases, that's very clear. And it's also, it is a discussion around expectation and understanding of gender in the United States, because I've read so many reports and all of these things talking about shortages of scientists, and we're not going to have enough engineers, and we need a student deferment so that we can continue having these people in the pipeline. And literally nobody talked about putting women into those positions. So it was such a grounded expectation that women were not doing these jobs and could not do these jobs and could not be tapped to do these jobs that kept this as a very masculine story. And what's really fascinating is that that's after World War II experience, when women were pulled into these jobs and there were special engineering training programs for women, and women were working in factories and elsewhere. And it's like that experience just vanished back to these expectations of a male breadwinner, woman at home structure for the household.
That's interesting. Okay. I also wanted to ask about, you had mentioned conscientious objector status. Do you have, so as far as I know, you can only get that deferment if you object to all war and not a specific war. If that's correct, can you just comment on that particular deferment? I find that interesting.
Sure. So there's been an option for conscientious objection for religious reasons through all American wars, certainly from World War I on, although the rules and regulations around it have changed. During World War I, a man had to be of from the specific historically peace churches. They had to be Quaker, they had to be Brethren. It was a very sort of limited number of people who were even allowed to qualify. During World War II, that was expanded out to a, quote, sincere religious objection to all war. And then over time, that has also been expanded through court cases and activism to include men who aren't religiously opposed, but morally or ethically opposed, simply because the rulings have been that if you require religion, then that violates the First Amendment. But the Supreme Court has been clear that whether it's a religious objection or a moral or ethical objection to war, it does have to be for all war. The selective conscientious objection is not recognized by anyone in the system as allowable. So what that means is that in order to get the deferment, you have to be able to prove it. And that, of course, is really hard. The way that it's traditionally been done is with essays and letters from pastors or other people talking about someone's pacifism in the past or how a person has grown into their objection to all war. That also makes it, up through the Vietnam era, to get a conscientious objector objection deferment, you had to be well educated and well connected. It was also a deferment that went overwhelmingly to people who were able to write clearly and well and have that structure in place. With
sort of these adjustments and changes made in deferments over the time of the draft, who were the primary movers of requesting these changes from their Congress people or whomever? You know, where were the pressures coming from?
That's a good question. All over. So the laws that create selective service and then authorize a draft are, generally speaking, written to be very vague. And then it's left to the Selective Service through its director, who through most of this time was Lewis B. Hershey, to put out regulations and suggestions to the state and local boards. But one of the things that Hershey did was that he very much wanted local boards to have autonomy to make decisions on their own. And so anything that came down from D.C., from his office, was basically treated as a suggestion rather than a requirement, which is one of the reasons why local boards could defer land-owning farmers in one place and maybe chose not to 3 counties over. So there wasn't a lot of consistency necessarily between them, which means that pressure came locally from local families around why their child should or should not be eligible or should not receive a deferment. There were large lobbies that were set up. Universities very much wanted student deferments. Professional organizations for scientists and doctors and engineers, they wanted deferments. There were individuals who wrote the president, individuals who wrote Hershey, individuals who wrote their local Congress people. So it was widespread. Everyone had an opinion about something.
Well, for a program that seemed to be completely centrally organized and imposed, it seems to be a very decentralized, or seems to have been a very decentralized system.
Yeah, it was. And that was one of the major complaints by the time of the Vietnam War, that this is not fair, it's not equitable, it's barely functional. And so there were some reforms that were put in place toward the end of the Vietnam War, the shift to a lottery, which would take a lot of the decisions out of individual boards' hands. It would spread the burden theoretically a little bit more equally, because keep in mind that counties that had fewer people tended to go much more deeply into their available pool than, say, a big city like New York.
Okay. Was there anything you came across that had a strong emotional impact on you, either positively or negatively?
It's a really good question. I think helping to understand my own family's experience, talking back to that grandfather and my dad and other people in my family, my father-in-law, who did end up serving in Vietnam in 1968, but probably, he was there. He got drafted on a fluke because someone didn't file paperwork that would have allowed him to get his deferment. I really think that that's one of the more interesting things that I found, is that this story helps people of that generation understand their own experiences in a different way. And that's been really gratifying.
It's interesting. In one respect, people don't want to go to war and risk death and killing and all that. But in a sense, it seems as though people who end up going to war have a more grounded, perhaps less romantic view of war than the people who stayed home supporting it but never actually went.
Yeah, I think that's true. And you can look at certainly the number of anti-war veterans that have existed in our history as well. And then also the fact that military service today under the all-volunteer force runs in families. And that is very clearly because the people who have connections to the military understand the realities, its benefits, its drawbacks, how it works, what it means, that in a way that people who have no one who serves in their family don't.
What do you hope the book will do?
I hope it will help people answer questions around their own experiences. I hope it will also push forward, this process that historians are already well into, of looking into how ideas about gender influence policy, how policy influences gender. In this particular case, I'm looking at those in relation to military service, but law is not impartial. It never has been. It never will be. And the ways that our government creates policy and law is based on our understandings in any given moment about something in particular. And they're not impartial. And I think that that's important.
Yeah. Did you have any difficulties getting the book published or finished?
Well, it was a long process. I had 2 kids and moved a couple of times in the process, so certainly from start to finish, it takes a long time. But it's an academic book, and so academic publishers exist to publish books written by historians. So getting it published was not terribly difficult. I think, I'm so excited to do a podcast and to push it out in ways that I can, because one of the things that academic publishers can't do is really push it out to the public. And despite its really long subtitle, I do think that there is interest here for people who aren't in academia.
Oh, definitely. I think so, too. So I know the book's already been published. Have you started another writing project, or do you have a project in mind?
Yes, so I am going to push this story forward in time and look at, I think, more individual people than policy, but that's yet to be determined. I'm really interested in the generations of anti-militarist activists from Vietnam really up until the present. And so I've begun work looking at some of those folks who pushed back against military service and this process, particularly around where Carter and then the Reagan administrations reinstituted registration. I didn't know until relatively recently that there were people who were arrested for not registering with the Selective Service and who did jail time. I'm interested in sort of how that activism works and when is anti-militarist activism successful, when is it not, what have been the effects of it. I think there is an argument to be made that selective service as it exists in our current moment is completely ineffective, that it is a failed system from start to finish. because no, it's not enforced. Those arrests stopped. Men sort of maybe do it by rote when they register for a driver's license or fill out a financial aid form for federal assistance. But no one gives it any thought. And it's for that reason, actually, that back in January, the Selective Service website crashed in the wake of the death of Soleimani of Iran, because suddenly there was this fear that the United States was going to go to war and there was going to be a draft. And what does this mean? And folks just have no idea. So there's more to the story. This book stops in 1973 when the draft stops. But the context of today is based on an all-volunteer force, and it's just completely different. And so I'm interested in moving that story chronologically forward.
Yeah, that would be interesting to read about. Where can people find you on the web? Do you have social media or anything?
I do. My Twitter handle is at AmyJ401, AmyJay401. I have a website at the university. The book is available through all online sellers. Okay.
All right. That's all the questions I have. Do you have any final thoughts or words?
No, I just want to thank you for doing what you're doing. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk. I hope it made some sense.
Oh, yeah,
and,
it did.
And thank you so much.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you for listening. You can find more podcasts like this on your favorite podcast feed under the title Military History Inside Out. That includes Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. One great way to support me is to rate my podcasts, either good or bad. You can find more great military history information at warscholar.org, on YouTube at Warscholar 1945, on Facebook at Warscholar, on Instagram at Chris Alvarez Warscholar, and on Twitter at Warscholar. Please support me by following me on those sites and liking my videos. If you like to read, don't forget to sign up for my weekly newsletter where I recommend newly published books. The subscription box is on my webpage. Thank you.